Yeah, please, if something is unclear for you and or you would like to me to say more about things I'm talking about, please just raise your hand or just tell me that you would like to know something, because I really would like to make it clear and easy for you. So if something requires more justification, more explanation for you, just tell me about it. So I entitled my lecture, my meeting with you today, Formal and Informal Logic in the Lwów-Warsaw School. And the plan of my lecture, the plan of our meeting is the following. I will start from some general facts about the school I will be talking about. I suppose that you know some of them, but repetition is always some good thing because you always remember better after some repetition. So I will present some basic facts. I will tell you what are, in my opinion, the most important features, characteristic features of this part of analytic movements. Then I will talk about branches of the school, including this formal and informal branch. And I will present some important dates in the development of the school. In the second part, I will focus on this distinction between formal and informal logic. This distinction is quite popular recently, but in fact, it is not always presented clearly enough. So I will just tell that behind this simple distinction, there are many various distinctions hidden. And always I will tell, also I will tell in this part in which sense the term logic was used in the school and how broadly logic was understood among members of the school. And in the end of the second part, I will show you a certain table with dates of publications of the most important logical textbooks and logical papers published between 91 and 1965. And this table shows this continuous development of both formal and informal logic in the school. And in part 3, I will focus on some examples. I will start from Kazimierz Twardowski, the founder of the school, who mainly focused with informal logic tools, but he also made some contributions to formal logic, and I will show what was this contribution, because he was not formal logician, but made some impact on his students in this domain. Then I will present some main ideas and personality of Jan Łukasiewicz. Jan Łukasiewicz was the one who introduced formal mathematical logic into the school. And so if Twardowski was very much on the informal side, then Łukasiewicz was very much on this formal side, let's say. And then I will present shortly the case study of Kazimierz Ajdukiewicz, who was somewhere in between. So he used both formal and informal methods in philosophy, both formal and informal logic in his philosophical investigations. And I will also end with some short closing remarks. Okay, so let's start from presenting the school. In general, so the Lwów-Warsaw School, basic facts. Well, I have to make one terminological remark because 100 years ago, Lviv, which is now a Ukrainian city and is a part of independent Ukraine. 100 years ago, it was a part of independent Poland, and Poles used to refer to the city as Lwów. And I will also refer in my talk, when I'm talking about Lwów 100 years ago, I will use this term Lwów. But of course, when I'm talking about the present situation in Lviv, I of course use the term Lviv. There is an interesting lecture of my friend and my former student Stepan Iwanek about the history of this term Lwów or Lwiw-Warsaw School. So if you are interested, this lecture may be found on YouTube. Stepan Iwanek wrote a PhD under my supervision, and it was about Ukrainians in this very school. So there were many interesting thinkers, mostly philosophers, not so much logicians, but philosophers that were of Ukrainian origin and studied under Twardowski. So as far as I know, Stepan's book is not translated into Ukrainian. I hope that should be done, but you may read it in Polish, of course, if some of you read Polish, and there are also some Stepan's papers in English written about this Ukrainian branch of the school. So generally one may say that the phenomenon of the Lwów-Warsaw School was international, because not only Poles, sometimes we forget that not only Poles belong to the school, but also people of Jewish and Ukrainian origin belong to it. So what are the most important facts about the school? Usually the school is understood as a group of people to which Kazimierz Twardowski, so the founder of the school, belong, students of Kazimierz Twardowski, and students of his students. Sometimes also other further generations of students are included into the school. It depends on how broadly we understand this phenomenon. It's important to stress that it was a school, not a circle like Vienna Circle, not just a group of colleagues, but it was really a school, because the very important relations between members of the school was relation teacher-student. In Polish language, I don't know if in Ukrainian it can be also used like that. We use, when we really respect our teacher, we use the term mistrz, like master, yeah, in English, in reference to such a person, such a teacher, a great teacher. And members of the school, Twardowski's students, usually called him their master, their mistrz. I know that in English it sounds a little bit weird, because they consider this master relation as something like slavery or something. So in English, when I'm talking to English people, usually do not mention that. But in the Polish language, there is no problem. Yeah, if we really consider our teacher a great person, we use this term master. So sometimes also the school is called the school of Kazimierz Twardowski, the master, and his students, who also became masters, great teacher for further generations of the school. So the school was quite a big phenomenon. If we look, for instance, as the Vienna Circle, which is sometimes compared to the school, there were about 15 members, regular members, some additional. And here in case of the school, there are about or even over 100 members of the school around 1939. What are dates important in the history of the school? Well, the initial date was, of course, 1895. It was a year when Kazimierz Twardowski, who was a Pole but born in the capital of Austria-Hungary, in Vienna, Twardowski, who was educated in Vienna and made his habilitation in University of Vienna, he came to Lwów to take chair for philosophy in Lwów, in Lemberg, because at that time it was a part of Austria-Hungary Empire. So in Lemberg, in Lwów, at that time he was able to teach philosophy in the Polish language because of this policy of Austria-Hungary. They tolerated various languages at universities, so Twardowski could teach philosophy in Polish, and he had a clear view how to build philosophical school. Twardowski's philosophical master, so his main teacher in philosophy, was Franz Brentano. Franz Brentano was a great Austrian philosopher who influenced many great scholars who developed his ideas in various directions, like Edmund Husserl, like Gestalt psychology, and Anton Marti, and so on, and of course also Twardowski, the founder of this Central European branch of analytic philosophy. So what were important places? At first, it was, of course, Lwów. Everything started then. Now, in 1915, during the First World War, University of Warsaw was reopened after a very long break because of the fact that it was Russian for a long time, a Russian city, and also it was Russian university in Warsaw. And in 1915, the Germans who took the city from Russians agreed to open a Polish university in this city in Warsaw. And after the city was opened, and the university was opened in Warsaw, Twardowski students educated in Lwów took chairs of philosophy and logic. So Jan Łukasiewicz, Stanisław Leśniewski, then Władysław Witwicki, all these who were educated by Twardowski in Lwów took chairs of philosophy in Warsaw. And this is why the school, Twardowski School, is now called Lwów-Warsaw School, because the most important branches of the school were these two cities, Lwów and Warsaw. But there were also other smaller branches, smaller centers of the school, like Wilno, now Vilnius, between 1920 and 39. It was then part of Poland at that time, and the University of Vilna was strongly influenced by Twardowski and his students. Also in Poznań, there was Kazimierz Ajdukiewicz, student of Twardowski, was a teacher of philosophy. In Krakow, there were Zawirski and Izydora Dąbska. In Toruń, with Tadeusz Czyżowski. In Wrocław, with Maria Kokoszyńska. Łódź with Kotarbiński for a short time. And also after the Second World War, there were some places abroad because of the Second World War. Some people, some members of the school had to emigrate, like Tarski, of course, emigrated just before the war. Jan Łukasiewicz emigrated in the end of the war. Henryk Hisz emigrated to Australia. So there were also some small centers of this logic and philosophy on emigration. Like I said, the school had an international structure because there were people of various origin in the school. And when we mention Kazimierz Twardowski as a great teacher, as a master of his students, his main feature was that he was very just. So he treated everyone equally. He evaluated his students only based on their academic effort, the results of their work, not based on nationality, none based on sex, for instance. So many also female students, there are many female students here with us, so let me mention also that there were really many female students, about members of Twardowski School, and women loved Twardowski because he never laughed at them, he never treated them differently than he treated men. That's why 1/3 of Twardowski's PhD students were female. It was really great number if we understand, if we are aware that women were allowed to universities in 1897. Okay, in Austria Empire, and at first this number of female students was very low. It was increasing during the time. So Twardowski was a great supporter of women at universities. And the most important time of the development of the school was between 1920 and 1939, because at the time Poland was an independent country, and there were many occasions to develop the cooperation. There were many centers active in this period. Okay. So I just mentioned that Twardowski, as the founder of the school, was a very important personality. Without his effort and his influence, the origin of the school would not be possible. What was so important in his attitude? Well, both his philosophy and his teaching activities, organizational activities were important here. As a philosopher, I think the most important thing was that his emphasis on his students was only methodological. So he did not impose on his students any of his, let's say, substantial views. He only required his students to do philosophy well, to justify their views, to speak in a clear way, okay? And he tolerated many different positions, also some positions, some views which were very different from his own, if only their students had a good support for their views. So this methodological foundations, this methodological emphasis was something important. According to Twardowski, there are two basic philosophical disciplines, and now you may be surprised because according to Twardowski, and this was something he took from Brentano, that one of basic disciplines was psychology, but the psychology has to be considered as descriptive psychology in Brentano's sense. So it means that it was a kind of theory of mind, yes, something like we now call philosophy of mind, because in descriptive psychology they analyze the elements of our consciousness. They defined what are judgments, what are concepts, okay? So this was not experimental psychology, of course, but conceptual investigations into the content of human's mind. And that, according to Twardowski and Brentano, that was the one of basic disciplines of philosophy. And another part of philosophical organon was, of course, logic. But according to Twardowski, it should be something like philosophical logic, soft logic. Yeah, he was suspicious towards the overuse of formal methods, but we'll come back to this idea a little bit later. In order to solve some philosophical problems, Twardowski used analytical methods like conceptual distinctions, analysis of various reasonings used in philosophy. So of course these are simply analytic methods which appeared also in Anglo-Saxon analytic philosophy at the same time. But the influence was not on Twardowski did not came from Anglo-Saxon philosophy. On the other hand, there is a scholar from yes, I know that Professor Komenko heard her paper during the round table, Maria van der Skar. Yeah, she proved that it was Twardowski that influenced Anglo-Saxon philosophy, not the vice versa, because he wrote a PhD in it was his habilitation, which was in some parts translated and presented by Stout, who was a teacher of Bertrand Russell and Moore. So that was the connection between Twardowski and Anglo-Saxon philosophy. And also Twardowski introduced to the school some prolific set of problems, like descriptive psychology, so I mean the theory of mind as we understand it presently. Also theory of object, so something we call now ontology, analytic ontology. Philosophical logic, later it was developed by Łukasiewicz to mathematical logic. He discussed what is scientific method, including the theory of reasoning, which was something Twardowski analyzed from the beginning. Twardowski also analyzed the relations between language, reality, and thinking. He very early wrote his very influential paper on the concept of truth. And also he introduced to the school the concept of independent ethics, which was also interesting and influential problem, but maybe for another meeting, and this problem of independent ethics in the school. So this was Twardowski's idea of philosophy. But if he just were such a philosopher and worked alone, he would not create the school. In order to create the school, he decided to make, first of all, didactic work, okay, to become a teacher. And sometimes we see that someone is a very good philosopher, but has no good students. because he's not able to give his time and efforts to teach correctly. And Twardowski was on this other side. He used to say that the aim to create a school was so important to him because his own ideas, he was aware that they may disappear somewhere, you know. But if you create school, these ideas are shared with someone, they are developed by your students, by your followers, and they will increase and increase in the future. That's why he didn't focus on his own career, which he could develop because there was a moment when he was very popular among German-speaking philosophers, but instead he wanted to build strong philosophical school in the Polish language in Polish universities. But of course, I have to say, because I sometimes stress this that he was a Pole, he was a Polish scholar. Yes, of course, this patriotic impulses were very important for Twardowski, but on the other hand, he was aware that philosophy, good philosophy, has no nationality. Okay, there are only philosophical problems which we consider from various perspectives, and also from the perspective of various ethnic languages. Sometimes they may look differently because our ethnic languages are parts of our conceptual schemes. But according to Twardowski, there's only one philosophy, and we should contribute to these philosophical problems as a whole, okay? So, of course, there were some patriotic inspirations in him, but he, first of all, wanted his students to develop philosophy as such, not particularly Polish philosophy. So he really devoted to this didactic work. He established in Lwów so-called philosophical seminar. He gave his all books, like 5,000 of books, to this seminar. Yeah, because the seminar at that time was not a meeting like we are meeting today, but it was a building with a library, with a reading room where students met and talked to each other, wrote their works, and Twardowski was for 8 hours a day with his students. He advised them what to do, how to prepare their works. There was very strict regulation of participants of this seminar. And Twardowski was very just, but also very strict. So if anybody broke the rule, he was just removed from the seminar. And despite this, he was really loved by his students. And it was difficult to become Twardowski students, but once you became a student, there were really close relations, and both between students and teacher, and also between students. And that's why they cooperated. They criticized each other. They read their own papers. Yeah, in such a way, Twardowski step by step created philosophical society. He also established an institution called Philosophical Society in Lwów. It was called Polish Philosophical Society. But now, a few years ago, Stepan Iwanek initiated Kazimierz Twardowski Philosophical Society in Lviv, which is somehow a continuation of that. So we are really glad that Kazimierz Twardowski is back in Lviv in such a sense. Okay, what's next? Now, well, I already said something about the features of the school, but let me repeat the most important features of the school once more. So the methodological foundations were very important. They are usually described as two basic methodological postulates: the postulates of precision and the postulate of justification. According to the postulate of precision, if a philosopher wants to state something, it has to be presented clearly and precisely. Okay, so when Twardowski taught at his seminar, he told their students to present, for instance, a philosophical paper, classical philosophical paper. They used to say, you have to state what this philosopher had in mind, but you have to express it more clearly than he he did it. Okay, so, and also your ideas have to be presented as clearly as possible. Twardowski also became famous in Lwów because some of his students used to say that he is able to present any philosophical problem, even the most complicated philosophical problem, in a clear manner. Yeah, so he even analyzed such problems as free will, okay, or the existence of soul, yeah, and even in such complicated matters, which are not so often analyzed in analytic philosophy, which usually is concerned with some, let's say, simpler problems. But he even such problems he could present in a simply manner, and he had this. It was possible for him to state where the problem is really located and what it consists in. And usually it was not possible to resolve the problem, but if you present the problem clearly and see where the problem, the core of the problem is located, all things become clearer. So this postulate of precision, the postulate of justification, according to this postulate, you have to justify your philosophical claim, and you are not allowed to accept a given sentence, a given philosophical claim with the strength which is bigger than justification you may provide to this claim. Another important element of Twardowski's school was interdisciplinarity. What I mean, well, Twardowski introduced in his philosophical investigation elements of various disciplines like psychology, like logic, but also linguistics, like humanities. And he was convinced that in order to analyze philosophical problems, you have to work interdisciplinary, like relation between thought and speech. That was one of basic problems Twardowski was interested in. Well, in order to analyze this problem and perhaps to solve this problem to some degree, you have to use some tools of logic, some elements of grammar, some elements of the theory of mind. Yeah. So according to Twardowski, the most important philosophical problems require interdisciplinarity. Now the term interdisciplinarity is popular again. We are forced to make some interdisciplinary project, interdisciplinary conferences, and so on. And Twardowski made it 100 years ago. Not all Twardowski students became equally interdisciplinary. For instance, Jan Łukasiewicz hated this interdisciplinarity. He used to say that, well, in Twardowski's seminar, you never knew whether you are at the level of grammar, or in logic, or in psychology. I hated that. I hated that. So some of Twardowski students didn't like this approach. And so some of them continued this interdisciplinary scheme, and some of them, like Jan Łukasiewicz, he became, let's say, intradisciplinary. So he only focused on logic and metaphysics. That was his area of interest. But Twardowski's ideas were developed in so many different directions only because of this element of interdisciplinarity. Okay. And of course, logical tools, that's once again element which is typical for all philosophy or analytical philosophy movements. Logical tools as an organon, as the basics for any research in philosophy. Yeah, now we got the branches of the school. Quite soon there appeared two branches of investigations of the school. Like I said, Twardowski was considered that there are two basic philosophical disciplines, psychology and logic, and the school developed in these two directions. And perhaps I will show the next slide, because after I thought about it for some time, I think that the correct presentation of these relations is the following scheme. Well, the most important branch of the school was, of course, philosophical. Yeah, so this center branch, because the school of Twardowski was first of all philosophical school, but together with Łukasiewicz, then Leśniewski, and in Warsaw also Tarski and their students, there was this important logical mathematical branch about which I guess that Professor Jan Woleński talked last week. It is also sometimes called Warsaw School of Logic. And the members of this branch had, of course, many results simply in mathematical logic, not in philosophy. They are famous for this result, like free-valued logic of Łukasiewicz, like conception of truth and semantics, theory of models of Tarski, Leśniewski's systems. So these are most important results of this logical mathematical branch. There was also purely psychological branch, which combined both descriptive psychology and experimental psychology, because Twardowski was the teacher of I think almost all psychologists in Poland, also in independent Poland. Okay, so he also introduced modern psychology in Polish universities, and members of the school were Kreutz, Balej, Błachowski. Balej is of Ukrainian origin. Yes, he was this member of Ukrainian branch of the school. At first, he published in Ukrainian. He wrote many papers in Ukrainian at first, but then when he became chair of psychology in Warsaw, he wrote mostly in Polish. Yeah, and the most important branch is philosophical, but philosophy in the school was also made in different ways. It was made by some of members more like with mathematical logical currents, and now when we consider Leśniewski's systems as axiomatized ontology, we may say that this is philosophy, that it is philosophical result, but made in this mathematical logical current. Okay. Also, Łukasiewicz trivalent logic, it's purely formal result, but it has philosophical interpretation because Łukasiewicz was indeterminist and used trivalent many-varied logic to justify his indeterminist philosophical intuitions. When we talk about Ajdukiewicz, he developed categorical grammar, which is formal analysis, but it has philosophical importance because it is theory of language. So in this broad philosophical branch, there is this mathematical current. This is psychological semiotic current, and now it's important to stress that Twardowski started from this descriptive psychology, which was conception of mind. So they were talking about presentations and concepts, about judgments, even in psychological sense, and so on. And in the course of the development of the school, these psychological investigations became semiotic investigations. So instead of talking about presentations and concepts, members of the school, students of Twardowski, started to talk about names, expressions. Yeah, instead of talking about judgments, they start to talk about sentences and relations between them. So, because Twardowski was interested in this relation between thought and language, it was easy to move from psychology to study of language. Yeah. And Professor Komenko mentioned that I'm a semiotician. Yes, and in fact, I am a member of the Department of Logical Semiotics, founded in Faculty of Philosophy of our university. And this very department is the continuation of this psychological semiotic current, okay, of the school, because it was founded by Jerzy Pelc, who was a student of Tadeusz Kotarbiński, who was a student of Kazimierz Twardowski. So I may say that somehow I belong to this tradition. And there is, of course, central current, which is in between of mathematical and psychological semiotic current. And when we in this broadest line, there is the list of philosophers listed from the most logical to least logical. So Leśniewski, Łukasiewicz, Ajdukiewicz are perhaps the most logical philosophers. Kotarbiński, Czyżowski, Kokoszyńska are in the middle, and Domska, Twardowski, Witwicki are more semiotic members of the school. But these are only some, of course, some representatives in order to show you this how it looked like generally. Okay, before going further, I will just tell you about the look from outside, how the Lwów-Warsaw School was seen by those who visited Poland. Rudolf Carnap visited Poland in 1930 and met with many Polish logicians and philosophers, and he wrote something like that. I found that the Polish philosophers had done a great deal of foregoing and fruitful work in the field of logic and its application to foundations problems, in particular the foundations of mathematics, the theory of knowledge, and the general theory of language, the results of which were almost unknown to philosophers in other countries. I left Warsaw grateful for many stimulating suggestions and fruitful exchange of ideas, which I enjoyed. And another view from outside, it is Ernest Nagel, an American philosopher who in the middle 30s, 1930s, visited Europe. And in Europe, he visited the following cities. He visited Cambridge, he visited Vienna, and he visited Lwów and Warsaw. So these four were for him the important centers of analytic philosophy. And then he came back to United States, to America, and wrote wrote an article. It's a big article, appraisals of analytic philosophy in Europe, something like that. And he wrote about Poland the following things. I found Poland to be an interesting and remarkable country philosophically. A nominalistic naturalism dominated by logico-analytic methods seems to be a part of the orthodoxy in most Polish universities. As in Russellized Cambridge, concerned with special problems rather than the manufactures of vast systems is the daily fare of both students and professors. I have been informed that the scientific tradition in philosophy harks back to the late of 18th century. That's true, in fact. Interest in logical studies in Poland, though naturally stimulated by work of Whitehead and Russell, has not been created by them. Some of those holding chairs of philosophy have been students of Frege and his writings, as well as those of Schroeder, who were students carefully long before Principia was born. Through Twardowski, now Professor Emeritus at Lwów, Brentano's version of Aristotelian realism received a wide hearing. All in all, if the men I met are representative of Polish philosophers, there is less romantic Schwärmerei among them than in any country with whose philosophical activity I am familiar. So this is Ernest Nagel. So I think that you may get the impression of how philosophy was practiced in the 30s. Okay, unfortunately, the tradition of Twardowski school, the Lwów-Warsaw School, was tragically collapsed with the outbreak of the Second World War. Many members died, some had to emigrate, the universities were closed, and so on and so on. After this time, Poland became a part of not Soviet Union like Ukraine, but it was influenced, it was the part of this Eastern Bloc, and of course there was a very, very strong ideological pressure. The only accepted philosophy was Marxism and Leninism, and philosophy of philosophers of the Lwów-Warsaw School were attacked by Communist Party. That's why the school could not continue its activities after the war. But from about 1970s, the tradition of the school started to restore, and around 2000, we may see a real renaissance of this tradition. It's really the number of publications, of course, stimulated by such professors as Professor Woleński and from Krakow, and Professor Jadacki from Warsaw, stimulated the new origin of this tradition. Okay, usually I talking too much about this starting things, but I think they are quite important, and I think that now I will be shorter. So now let's move to some conceptual distinctions. I told you that I would like to focus on some distinctions between formal versus informal logic. What is important to stress is that when we use the term logic, logika in Polish, in English logic, and in many various ethnic languages it sounds perhaps similar. We think something different today than we thought, that people thought 100 years ago. And for instance, in recent decades, there appeared so-called informal logic initiative. First publications were about 1978 or something. And they introduced this informal logic as something which opposed to formal logic, which was dominating or is still dominating sense of the term logic. So usually when someone says that he is a logician, we think that he is a formal logician, mathematical logician, okay? And it was different 200 years ago when Jan Łukasiewicz, Alfred Tarski or Stanisław Leśniewski started to work. Logic was something different, something broader. It was more like philosophical logic. And in fact, Jan Łukasiewicz had to write a paper in defense of logistics, so in defense of mathematical logic, because people didn't want to include mathematical logic in the field of logic. Okay, so this perspective completely changed in this last century. And we may read this paper and be amused that he had to write in defense of logistic. Yes, logistic was used by Polish logicians in reference. This term was in reference to mathematical logic. So it's really changed. And now, what these members of informal logic initiative state? Well, they say something like that. Informal logic designates that branch of logic whose task is to develop non-formal standards, criteria, procedures for the analysis, interpretation, evaluation, critique, and construction of argumentation in everyday discourse. So they state that mathematical logic says nothing about our everyday discourse, our everyday thinking, so it's unimportant. What more? Informal logic is the attempt to develop a logic to assess, analyze, and improve ordinary language, everyday reasoning. It interacts with attempts to understand such reasoning from the point of view of philosophy, formal logic, cognitive psychology, and a range of other disciplines. And finally, informal logicians use variables and talk about argument schemes, which are quasi-formal. So informal logic is not strictly speaking informal, and you understand by logic the study of axiomatized deductive systems. Informal logic is not logic. So in fact, it happens that the term logic is understood now, usually is understood very broadly. And this informal logic initiative is contrasted to this general trend. But if we look at logic in Lwów-Warsaw School, it was considered very broadly. And all these problems which are mentioned here as something new that has to be analyzed by logic, all these problems were already present and analyzed in the Lwów-Warsaw School. And we look at the development of the school, this everyday thinking, analysis of reasoning, and so on. All these problems were present and analyzed in the school. I told you that, according to me, behind this formal and informal distinction, there are in fact many different distinctions hidden inside. What I mean, for instance, logic may study or construct formal languages or informal languages. So different kinds of languages are studied by logicians, or logicians also construct languages. And sometimes I think it's one of the most important and troublemaking mistake of some analytic philosophers, that they think that there are only two types of languages. There are some natural languages or ethnic languages, and there are formal languages. Well, in my opinion, it is also something based on the study of the attitude of the Lwów-Warsaw School, there is a continuity of languages which are more and more formal. Of course, we don't intervene in natural languages like Polish or Ukrainian, so these are purely informal languages. But for instance, languages of different sciences like physics, like biology, like musicology or something like that, they are not natural languages, but they are also not formal languages. There are somewhere in between. Okay, so when we say that logic studies languages, it may also study these semi-formal languages, because there is a continuity of different languages in our world. What's more, logic may use formal or mechanical methods or informal methods. Yes, this idea of mechanization of thinking was something quite important and it played a great role in the appearance of the new tools of proof and so on. And this mechanization was also important because this is what machines could do, yes, so mechanize our thinking. But it is something different because than different languages. Okay, mechanizations of reasoning is something different than various stages of formality of our language. So this is different, another distinction. And mathematical logic versus philosophical logic. When we look at what, for instance, Jan Łukasiewicz wrote about logic, he used the term philosophical logic in order to refer to some bad logic made by Kant or some other philosophers from 18th century. And mathematical logic was something made by mathematicians, but it is not said that, for instance, now philosophers made some bad logic. Okay, so that's another distinction based on, I think, the genesis, yeah, of logical investigations. There are some more philosophically motivated and some mathematically motivated studies. And finally, there is a distinction into pure logic and applied logic. And now these applications of logic also are very, very diversified. For instance, it is different to apply logic into mathematics or IT. And it's different to talk about, when you are talking about applications of logic into philosophy, humanities, and everyday thinking. So I just wanted, because it's a seminar about philosophy of logic, I just wanted to mention that behind this this distinction, sometimes introduced, there are many different areas hidden, and we have to be aware when we are introducing some distinctions that the matter is usually very, very complicated. What was the concept of logic in the Lwów-Warsaw School? It's important to remember that it was very broad, and usually 3 different disciplines were mentioned. Let's look at these 3 quotations. Kazimierz Ajdukiewicz. The usual partition of logic, which is influenced by psychology, divides it into elementary logic and methodology, while elementary logic covers knowledge about concept, judgments, and conclusion, and thus about certain psychic phenomena. And our division, so this is the division introduced by Ajdukiewicz, our division is semasiology, so semiotics in other words. He preferred to use this French word, but then they used semiotics, logical semiotics, formal logic, and methodology. Yeah? So these 3 branches covers logic. Now, Kotarbiński, 20 years later, wrote, I would be glad to see logic defined broadly, covering not only formal logic, but also the theory of cognition, semantics, the science of categories, as well as general and detailed methodology of scientific research and teaching of the results of such research. So once again, not only formal logic, but also theory of cognition, so very, very broadly understanding of logic, semantics, the science of categories and methodology. And finally, Józef Bocheński, who was also closely connected with the school. Today, logic consists of 3 main parts, namely formal logic, which is a theory of objects in general and therefore a kind of ontology, of a general methodology of sciences, and of semiotics, that is a logical theory of speech. Formal logic currently has a mathematical form or a logistic. So the concept of logic in the school introduced the following division. We've got formal logic, or the theory of formal languages and axiomatized theories, logical semiotics, theory of science, especially of language science, and methodology, namely theory of cognitive science creating operations. So if we now look that presently this formal and informal distinction is introduced, we may ask, does it mean that logical semiotics and methodology is this informal logic? Of course, no. We may make also logical semiotic problems and study methodological problems with formal tools. So we may say that all these areas of logic intervene, yeah, and they influence one another. Yeah. Yeah, and now ending this part with distinctions, I would only like to show this table in which there are important dates of the development of logic in the Lwów-Warsaw School, with this division into informal and formal, and we may see that these phenomena developed just simultaneously. For instance, in 1895, Twardowski came to Lwów and he started to lectures in informal logic, but already in 1899, he started to lecture on reformatory aspirations in the field of formal logic. Why I put it on the left, so on the side of informal logic? Because Twardowski presented this formal logic, but he was very critically. Yes, his attitude was critical, so that's why it was a criticism from the point of view of informal logic. Now, in 1901, Twardowski published his book, Basic Concepts of Didactics and Logic, and the same year he wrote about a paper on formalism in logic, when he presented the newest approaches to formal logic. Then Jan Łukasiewicz became independent thinking after making his PhD by Twardowski, and he started in 1906 in Lwów. He started to lecture on algebraic logic. In 1910, he published his famous work on the principle of contradiction by Aristotle, where in the appendix there is a big chapter on the mathematical logic, what mathematical logic states about the principle of contradiction. Okay. Then Łukasiewicz was joined by Stanisław Leśniewski, and Stanisław Leśniewski, definitely formal logician, published his Foundations of the General Theory of Sets, and so on. Now, new members of this logical branch appeared. Tadeusz Czerzowski in 1918 wrote his PhD about class theory, and in 1920, Jan Łukasiewicz discovered his free-varied logic. It was for sure formal logic. But in 1921, Twardowski writes a very influential paper, Symbolomania and Pragmatophobia. What does it mean? In this paper, Twardowski criticized the overuse of formal methods, yeah, because he was afraid that his students start to play with symbols without any reference to reality. And he was just afraid that they will forget about how to use logic to philosophical problems and to ordinary thinking, which was all the time very important to Twardowski. Let's look further. In 1929, Kotarbiński, a student of Twardowski, writes his book, Elements of the Theory of Cognition, Formal Logic and the Methodology of Sciences. It included some elements of formal logic, but even more of informal logic, okay? So it's famous textbook of Kotarbiński called Elementy. But the same year, Łukasiewicz publishes his book Elements of Mathematical Logic, which is very formal textbook. In the 30s, Łukasiewicz and Tarski published their investigations into sentential calculus, In 1939, Leśniewski, another book on formal matters on the foundations of mathematics. And finally, Tarski in 1933, the concept of truth in formalized languages. But only 1 year later, Ajdukiewicz publishes his textbook in Informal Logic, Logical Foundations of Teaching. In 1936, Tarski publishes Wprowadzenie do logiki, Introduction to Logic and the Methodology of Deductive Sciences. But after the war, because there was a break, Kotarbiński publishes his textbook in Informal Logic, a course of logic for lawyers. And even in the 60s, there is a textbook in formal logic, mathematical logic, written by Grzegorczyk, who was a student of Ajdukiewicz and Kotarbiński, Zarys logiki matematycznej, Outline of Mathematical Logic. But 4 years later, Ajdukiewicz publishes Logika Pragmatyczna, Pragmatic Logic. So I think that this table, these dates, these publications prove my thesis that the logic in both formal and informal way were practiced continuously in the tradition of the Lwów-Warsaw School. Yeah, and now let's look at the part 3. If I'm talking too long, just please tell me. I will try to do my best to be fast now. Yeah, shortly about Twardowski, I already told you that what was his influence and his idea of philosophy. He was convinced that logical education was necessary at every level of education, and the knowledge of logic is important to every citizen. Among problems of logical culture, so these areas of informal logic, analyzed by Twardowski, there are such things as independence of thinking, mistakes in thinking, kinds of reasoning, meaning analysis, etc. And what Witwicki wrote about him, about Twardowski, he was the first in Poland to give lectures on algebraic logic, but he himself always wrote in the ordinary Polish language, which we speak on an everyday basis. But he did it so more precisely. He respected algebra very much, but in others. This was what Witwicki, a Twardowski student, wrote. And Alfred Tarski wrote in 1938, almost all researchers who pursue the philosophy of exact sciences in Poland are direct or indirect disciples of Twardowski. So we may see that despite Twardowski was not a formal logician, he made so many impulses that that was him who enabled the development of logic in Poland. Yeah, that's perhaps I will skip. Yeah, perhaps I will only quote this symbolomania and pragmatophobia because it's perhaps an interesting title for you. Like I said, Twardowski criticized the overuse of formal methods because he was afraid that those who are occupied, those minds, young minds especially, which are occupied with formal tools, forget about reality and about real problems. He wrote something like that. It seems that there are minds for whom the symbols and the operations performed on them are originally the means to an end, become an end to itself. Indeed, the symbol represents the concept or object symbolized by it, whence the illusion easily arises in which the former replaces the latter. But representation is not, after all, the same as replacement. Yeah, and he also wrote, irrespective of the soil from which symbolomania and pragmatophobia grow in a given case, and to what category that case is assigned, it is never just an innocent symptom. It can exert a negative influence in a variety of ways, beginning the realm of investigations conducted by symbolophiles and pragmatophobes. The tendency to set symbols above things may lead to subjugating things to symbols, which means that what is asserted of things follows from symbolic presuppositions and operations, irrespective of what the things say about themselves, or even contrary to what they say about themselves. Yeah, Jan Łukasiewicz, that was the one who introduced formal logic into the Lwów-Warsaw School. He was a student of Twardowski, but then was influenced also by Frege and also by Russell, because in 1995 Łukasiewicz read not Principia Mathematica, which were published later, but Principles of Mathematics, this book published by Russell in 1901, I think, or 1903. And Łukasiewicz was really appreciated this book much more than Principia Mathematica, which was, according to Łukasiewicz, unclear. But this one, this earlier book by Russell influenced Łukasiewicz. He was also fascinated by Aristotle, by scholasticism, and all of this led Łukasiewicz to mathematical logic. What he wrote about logistic, mathematical logic. Logistic, also called mathematical logic, still seems to some philosophers to be just certain trend that exists with logic alongside other equally valid trends, while for some mathematicians it seems to have only the value of an auxiliary science created in order to provide the foundations of mathematics. Therefore, I would like to emphasize that I treat logistic as an autonomous science that embodies modern formal scientific logic, and that it would not be possible to me to consider apart from logistics some logical trend that could be regarded as scientific logic. Historically, and this is what I would like to place particular emphasis on, modern logistic is a higher development stage of ancient formal logic, which fully flourished only thanks to the fact that with the cooperation of mathematicians, it was fortunately able to free itself from the vague philosophical speculations that had been hindering its progress for so long. So we feel here, yes, this opposition, yeah, between Twardowski and Łukasiewicz, who really believed in mathematical logic. He was also a historian of logic, so that's why he really responsibly could say that the newest developments of mathematical logic are natural continuations of what ancient logicians tried to do. Okay. And Kazimierz Ajdukiewicz was someone in between, because as we look at his philosophy in his investigations, he was convinced that both formal and informal logic may be used in philosophy, and these both trends are equally important. He was a student and also son-in-law of Twardowski, because he married Twardowski's daughter. He was also a student of Łukasiewicz and Hilbert, so he was somehow influenced by Hilbert's formalism. And he started from mathematical logic, from formalism. He investigated formal systems, he invented categorical grammar, but then he gradually softened his position. And in his later decades, he was occupied with the idea how to increase logical culture at every level of education and in everyday life. So we may say that after Twardowski, his father-in-law died, he took the position of his teacher, okay, and considered this problem of informal logic even more important than formal ones. Yeah, I think that you may be tired for this long quotation, but maybe this one. He wrote something like that: logical curricula as an constituent of so-called general education should, in my opinion, be revised. Firstly, in any formal logic is necessary for students who are becoming familiar with logic as service subject. It is the logic of sentences built from words of the natural language that students use in life and during their studies, not the formal logic of an artificial language. Secondly, it seems that drawing attention to logical errors that are often encountered and warning about them is especially significant when it comes to logical repair of minds. Science regarding logical errors should definitely be extended on the basis of vast studies and monitoring of human illogicalness. This logical pathology should capture logical errors and flaws in speeches, debates, literature, and press red-handed. Yeah, and I'm really coming to the end. I will only would like to add that what was the opinion of the philosophers and logicians I was talking about the use of logical tools in philosophy. Well, Twardowski was convinced that in order to solve any philosophical problems, soft logical tools should be used, like conceptual distinctions, removing ambiguities, analysis of reasoning, etc. All Twardowski students and followers shared this view and used these informal methods. But then there was Jan Łukasiewicz, who proposed the program of logicization of philosophy. Exactly in 1927, in his speech during Philosophical Congress in Warsaw, he proposed this program and the steps to realize this program, to use the formal methods in philosophy. So he proposed to present philosophical systems in a form of axiomatic systems. Just a few years later, Stanisław Leśniński and Alfred Tarski introduced metalogic and semantics to philosophical investigations. Tarski proposed the correct conception of truth for formal languages and introduced epistemological elements to logical investigation, let's say. And finally, Ajdukiewicz showed that metalogical tools may be applied to resolution of some epistemological problems, for instance, to refute so-called transcendental idealism. And also, all members of the school were convinced that logic is an important element in for everyone, yeah, in everyday our life, in everyday speech, in our thinking. And another set of quotations, according to Twardowski, logic is important for two reasons. It prevents our own mistakes of thinking and helps to recognize that other people are not right in their thinking. Łukasiewicz wrote so beautifully, let's look at this. It is as if the scales fall from the eyes of whoever has educated themselves in exact thinking of mathematical logic. They see differences where others do not, and they see nonsenses where others look for some mysterious depth. At some point, such a person concludes with horror that even through more than 2000 years have passed since the creation of logic, we do not know how to think logically, we do not know how to think exactly, consistently, diligently in philosophy and in other sciences. I believe that mathematical logic will teach us exact thinking. And Ajdukiewicz wrote that logic in the broad sense of the term could be also called a theory of science. From a general point of view, it deals with tools and methods, that is, with the procedures used in the sciences. Since the methods used in sciences are also sometimes applied in everyday life, the scope of logic's thesis reaches beyond science, including the cognitive practice of everyday life. So, my last slide from you, some closing remarks, recapitulation, let's say. Firstly, the concept of logic accepted in the Lwów-Warsaw School was broad and included formal logic as well as methodology of sciences and logical semiotics. Secondly, the problems of so-called informal logic were analyzed in the school from the beginning. Logisticians and soft logicians influenced each other. Twardowski was not only the founder of the school, but he was first to lecture mathematical logic in Poland. He was also the great propagator of logical culture. Logicians or mathematical logicians of the school, and I mean Łukasiewicz, Leśniewski, Tarski and others, were more careful about the interpretation of their systems than logicians from other European centers. That was because of symbolomania and pragmatophobia written by Twardowski. And finally, the representatives of the moderate branch of the school, such people like Ajdukiewicz, Kotarbiński, Czerzowski, contributed perhaps to the problems of informal logic to the greatest degree. These are my references, and thank you for your attention.